In the heart of Charlotte, North Carolina, nestled among tree-lined streets and pristinely manicured lawns, the Kane residence stood as a beacon of suburban perfection. To the neighbors, Gavin Kane was the ideal husband, steady, hard-working, and utterly devoted to his wife, Emma. Their two-story colonial-style home, adorned with blooming hydrangeas in the spring, seemed to embody their shared dreams. Yet, behind the charming facade, a storm was brewing, one that would shatter the idyllic image forever. For Emma, life with Gavin was, in many ways, what she had always imagined. A deeply compassionate woman, she poured her heart into her community, organizing charity drives and hosting neighborhood events. She had a smile that could light up any room and an unwavering faith in her husband, who had always been her pillar of support. But lately, Emma couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in their marriage, the creeping distance in Gavin's eyes, the late nights explained away as work emergencies, and the quiet tension that hung heavy in the air. Unbeknownst to Emma, Gavin carried a secret so monumental that it threatened to unravel everything they had built. For years, he had meticulously buried his past, constructing a new identity piece by piece. Born as Chloe Kane, Gavin had endured a lifetime of silent struggles, navigating the harsh realities of growing up in a conservative Alabama town. The constant dissonance between who he was and who the world expected him to be had been suffocating, driving him to Charlotte in search of freedom and reinvention. By the time he met Emma in 2006, Gavin had fully transitioned, leaving Chloe behind. His identity as a man was complete, at least on the surface. He never told Emma about his past, convincing himself that it didn't matter. After all, they were happy. Emma loved him, and Gavin adored her in return. But as much as he tried to bury his old life, shadows of it clung to him, whispering fears of exposure. The cracks began to show in March 2012. Gavin had joined a new gym in an attempt to channel his growing anxiety into physical exertion. It was there that he met Vanessa Hale, a magnetic presence with a sharp wit and a smile that turned heads. What began as light-hearted banter over treadmills quickly escalated into something more dangerous. Vanessa was intoxicating, an escape from the weight of Gavin's double life. With her, he felt a rush of freedom he hadn't known in years. But with freedom came risk. Emma, ever perceptive, noticed the changes. Gavin's once familiar affection felt distant, his warm embraces replaced by hurried goodnights. There were whispered phone calls in the study, the smell of cologne lingering when he returned home late. Emma's intuition told her something was wrong, though she couldn't yet put her finger on it. As the days passed, Emma's suspicions grew, setting the stage for a confrontation that would force buried truths to the surface. For now, though, the Kane household remained deceptively calm, like the stillness before a storm. Yet even Gavin knew that calm wouldn't last. Gavin Kane wasn't always Gavin. Decades before the life he meticulously crafted in Charlotte, North Carolina, he was born as Chloe Kane, a name that felt more like a prison than an identity. Growing up in a conservative Alabama town, Chloe lived under the watchful eyes of neighbors who believed in tradition and conformity. Her parents, devout churchgoers with unyielding expectations, expected her to be the perfect daughter, graceful, obedient, and feminine. But from a young age, Chloe knew she didn't fit the mold. The dissonance between her true self and the life she was forced to live was a constant ache. She would watch the boys on the playground, wishing she could join their rough-and-tumble games instead of being pushed toward dollhouses and ribbons. At home, her mother fussed over Sunday dresses and braided hair, while Chloe silently longed for short haircuts and sneakers. Every reminder of what she was supposed to be deepened her sense of alienation. By the time she reached high school, Chloe had perfected the art of invisibility. She wore the dresses, smiled when expected, and avoided conversations that veered too close to her inner struggles. But inside, a storm brewed. Every day felt like a performance, a desperate act to avoid the scrutiny of her peers and family. She found solace in fleeting moments, tucking her hair under a baseball cap, wearing her brother's oversized shirts when no one was home, but these glimpses of freedom were never enough. Her small-town environment only amplified her feelings of entrapment. Alabama was not a place where people spoke openly about gender or identity. The rare instances when such topics arose were shrouded in judgment and ridicule. Chloe knew that admitting the truth about herself would mean rejection, not just from her community but also from her family. And so, she kept silent. It wasn't until college that Chloe finally found the courage to confront her truth. At 18, she received an acceptance letter to a university in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city that felt like another world compared to the confines of her hometown. Moving there wasn't just a step toward education, it was an escape. For the first time, Chloe had the freedom to explore who she truly was without the weight of small-town expectations pressing down on her shoulders. The journey wasn't easy. Chloe began researching the term she had stumbled upon in an online forum, transgender. The word felt like a revelation, a label that finally made sense of her lifelong discomfort. The more she read, the more she understood that she wasn't alone. There were others like her, people who had taken the brave steps to live authentically. And yet, the road ahead was daunting. Chloe took her first steps toward transitioning in her early 20s, starting with hormone therapy. Each injection brought a mix of hope and fear. The changes came slowly, her voice deepened, her features sharpened, but every small step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. She worked tirelessly to save money for top surgery, enduring grueling part-time jobs and sleepless nights. The surgery itself was a painful yet transformative milestone. For the first time, Chloe looked in the mirror and saw Gavin staring back, a man who had fought to exist. Legally changing her name to Gavin Kane was both liberating and terrifying. It marked the end of Chloe and the beginning of the person she always knew she was. But it also meant severing ties with her past. She stopped calling her family, unable to face their questions or judgment. Letters from her mother went unanswered, and her father's sporadic voicemails were deleted without listening. Gavin told himself it was a necessary sacrifice, a small price to pay for freedom. By the time Gavin turned 25, his transition was complete, at least on the surface. He landed a stable job in construction management, a field where his masculine demeanor and physical strength fit naturally. For the first time, Gavin felt in control of his life. No one at work questioned him, no one in his social circles suspected a thing. To them, Gavin Kane was simply a hard-working, reserved young man. Yet the shadows of Chloe lingered. Gavin avoided close relationships, fearing that someone might see through the cracks in his carefully constructed identity. The thought of revealing his past to anyone felt unthinkable. He convinced himself that Chloe was dead, buried along with the pain of his childhood. The past didn't matter anymore, Gavin told himself, it was the present that counted. When Gavin met Emma in 2006, she became the final piece of his reinvention. Her warmth and optimism made him feel safe, like he could finally build the life he had always dreamed of. But even as he fell in love, he knew he couldn't tell her the truth. The risk was too great. And so, he buried Chloe deeper, locking that part of himself away, believing it would never resurface. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. Gavin's perfect life was built on a foundation of lies, and he knew that any crack in the facade could bring everything crashing down. In 2006, when Gavin Kane met Emma, it felt like a spark of destiny. They crossed paths at a charity event in Charlotte, where Emma, with her warm smile and effortless charm, was helping organize a fundraiser for a local shelter. Gavin had attended reluctantly, dragged along by a coworker, but the moment he saw her, he couldn't look away. Emma radiated kindness, the sort of person who made you feel seen even in a crowded room. For Gavin, who had spent years keeping people at arm's length, she was magnetic. Their courtship was fast but not rushed. Emma, ever the open-hearted optimist, embraced Gavin with unshakable trust. She loved his steadiness, the way he listened more than he spoke, and the quiet strength he carried in everything he did. Gavin adored her in return. She made him feel like he could finally let his guard down, though only a little. There were parts of himself he vowed she would never see. By the end of the year, Gavin proposed during a quiet dinner at a small Italian restaurant they frequented. Emma's enthusiastic yes drew applause from the other diners, and Gavin felt a rare surge of hope that he might finally have the life he'd always wanted. They married in 2007 in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by Emma's close-knit family and friends. Gavin's side of the aisle was notably sparse, something he brushed off with vague explanations about strained family ties. Emma didn't press him, she respected his boundaries, a trait that Gavin was grateful for, and quietly used to his advantage. Their early years of marriage felt like a dream. They bought a charming colonial-style house in a family-friendly neighborhood and spent their weekends painting rooms, planting a garden, and talking about the future. Emma often spoke of having children, imagining the pitter-patter of little feet echoing through the hallways. Gavin would nod and smile, deflecting the conversation with mentions of work deadlines or finances. The idea of children terrified him, not because he didn't want them, but because they might lead to questions about his past he wasn't prepared to answer. Emma saw Gavin as the perfect partner. He was dependable, attentive, and hard-working. What she didn't see was the constant effort it took for Gavin to maintain the illusion. Every detail of his life had to be curated to avoid suspicion. Medical records were locked away in a drawer, distant relatives were avoided, and any mention of his childhood was deflected with practiced ease. Over time, the weight of this deception began to wear on Gavin. He loved Emma deeply, but every moment with her was a reminder of the lies he lived. Emma, ever intuitive, sometimes sensed Gavin's unease. She chalked it up to stress from his demanding job in construction management, where long hours and tight deadlines were the norm. Gavin leaned into this excuse, often using work as a shield to avoid deeper conversations. When Emma suggested therapy to help him manage his stress, Gavin quickly dismissed the idea, claiming he could handle things on his own. Despite these cracks, their marriage seemed perfect from the outside. To their neighbors, the Caines were the ideal couple, supportive of each other, active in the community, and always quick to lend a helping hand. Emma, with her boundless energy, organized block parties and volunteered at local charities. Gavin, though quieter, attended every event at her side, playing the role of the doting husband flawlessly. But beneath the surface, the strain of living a double life began to take its toll. Gavin's fear of discovery lurked in every interaction, every casual question about his past. He avoided deep friendships, even within their neighborhood, terrified that someone might dig too deep. The secrecy gnawed at him, but he told himself it was necessary. Telling Emma the truth felt unthinkable. How could she understand? How could anyone? As the years passed, Emma occasionally wondered why Gavin seemed so reluctant to open up about his family or his childhood. When she asked, he would deflect with vague stories about growing up in a small, uneventful town or talk about how he'd always been focused on moving forward rather than looking back. His answers satisfied her for the most part, but a small part of her always felt there was more to the story. By 2012, their marriage had settled into a comfortable rhythm, but the spark that had defined their early years began to fade. Gavin grew more distant, retreating further into himself as his anxiety about being exposed intensified. Emma noticed the changes. He was less affectionate, more preoccupied, but she told herself it was just a rough patch, something all couples go through. Gavin, on the other hand, felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in. The secret he had buried so deeply was no longer just a shadow in the back of his mind, it was a weight pressing down on him every day. And he knew that if Emma ever found out, the life they had built together would crumble in an instant. By early 2012, the once stable foundation of Gavin and Emma Caine's marriage began to tremble. Emma couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when things had shifted, but the changes were undeniable. Gavin had grown distant, both physically and emotionally. The long conversations they once shared in the evenings were now replaced with brief exchanges over late dinners, his face often buried in his phone or a stack of work documents. He started coming home later, offering vague excuses about work deadlines and project meetings that stretched late into the night. Emma wanted to believe him, she always had, but the gnawing feeling in her gut told her otherwise. For Gavin, the growing distance wasn't entirely intentional. It was the natural byproduct of the anxiety that consumed him. Every day, he juggled the weight of two lives, the devoted husband Emma believed him to be and the man who was keeping a monumental secret from her. And now, a third layer of complication had entered the picture, Vanessa Hale. Vanessa was unlike anyone Gavin had ever met. She was bold, magnetic, and exuded a confidence that Gavin found both intimidating and irresistible. They had met by chance at the gym in early March, striking up a conversation over shared fitness routines. At first, their interactions were innocent, friendly chats about exercise tips or weekend plans. But Vanessa's fiery personality and flirtatious energy quickly pulled Gavin into dangerous territory. What began as harmless banter escalated rapidly. By mid-March, Gavin and Vanessa were involved in a full-blown affair. Their meetings were clandestine and thrilling, held in shadowed corners of the city where no one would recognize them. For Gavin, the affair offered a fleeting escape, a way to momentarily forget the lies he lived with Emma and the constant fear of his past being uncovered. With Vanessa, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years, but the exhilaration was laced with guilt and dread. Emma, ever perceptive, began to notice changes in Gavin. He had always been a reserved man, but now his behavior bordered on secretive. His phone, once left on the kitchen counter without a second thought, was now glued to his side, often set to silent. There were hushed phone calls he claimed were work-related and an unfamiliar cologne lingering faintly on his clothes when he returned home. The warmth that had defined their relationship felt like it was slipping through her fingers. By late March, Emma's suspicions had grown too large to ignore. She found herself replaying conversations in her mind, searching for clues that might explain Gavin's recent behavior. When she asked him outright why he seemed so distant, he deflected with rehearsed ease, attributing his stress to mounting work pressures. But his explanations rang hollow, and Emma's instincts told her there was more to the story. Meanwhile, Vanessa was growing impatient. The thrill of their affair had begun to wane for her, replaced by a desire for something more permanent. She was tired of being Gavin's secret, tired of sneaking around and hiding in the shadows. On March 28, during one of their clandestine meetings, Vanessa confronted Gavin. Her ultimatum was simple: leave Emma, or she would expose their affair. The threat sent Gavin into a spiral. His life, already precariously balanced on a foundation of lies, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Vanessa didn't know about his past, about Chloe Kane or the journey that had brought him to this point. But Gavin knew that if the affair came to light, it was only a matter of time before everything else unraveled. Emma, heartbroken and betrayed, would start asking questions. And Gavin feared that the answers to those questions would destroy him completely. The pressure mounted as April approached. Gavin found himself torn between two lives, each one threatening to destroy the other. At home, Emma's quiet observations and growing unease pressed against him, her unspoken questions lingering in every glance. With Vanessa, the demands for commitment and transparency pushed him closer to the breaking point. Gavin knew he had to make a decision, but every option felt like a step toward ruin. One evening, after yet another strained conversation with Emma, Gavin sat alone in his car, parked on a darkened street a few blocks from their house. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He could end things with Vanessa and hope she wouldn't follow through on her threats, but that risked her anger and retaliation. He could confess everything to Emma, but the thought of her reaction was unbearable. Or he could continue juggling both lives, knowing it was only a matter of time before the facade cracked completely. As the weeks passed, Emma grew more determined to uncover the truth. Her love for Gavin had always been her anchor, but now it felt like a weight pulling her into murky waters. She began to watch him more closely, taking mental notes of his comings and goings, piecing together the fragments of his strange behavior. She didn't yet know what she would find, but she knew one thing with certainty: the man she had married was hiding something. And she was determined to uncover it. The cracks in their perfect facade were widening, and beneath them, the storm was gathering. Neither Gavin nor Emma could see it yet, but their lives were hurtling toward a collision that would leave nothing unchanged. By the beginning of April 2012, Emma Kane's suspicions had reached a boiling point. She could no longer deny the changes in Gavin. His late nights, furtive phone calls, and evasive answers gnawed at her, each moment chipping away at the trust she had built her marriage upon. The man she had once believed to be her safe harbor now felt like a stranger. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma decided it was time to stop waiting for answers and start finding them herself. On the evening of April 5, Gavin left the house, claiming he needed to meet a colleague for a work emergency. Emma watched him from the window as he got into his car, her stomach churning with dread. Something about the way he avoided her gaze before walking out the door confirmed what she had feared: he was lying. Grabbing her keys, she decided to follow him, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Trailing Gavin through the quiet streets of Charlotte, Emma kept her distance, careful not to draw attention to herself. After about 20 minutes, she watched as he pulled into the parking lot of a small motel on the outskirts of town. From her vantage point in a shadowed corner of the lot, Emma saw him step out of the car and approach a woman waiting near the entrance. Even in the dim light, it was clear this wasn't a professional meeting. The woman, whom Emma would later learn was Vanessa Hale, greeted Gavin with a familiarity that made Emma's stomach twist. She watched as they disappeared together into a room, leaving her frozen in shock. Emma sat in her car for what felt like hours, staring at the motel room door. The image of Gavin with another woman was a betrayal she hadn't been prepared for, but as the initial wave of heartbreak subsided, anger and curiosity began to take hold. If Gavin was capable of hiding an affair, what else was he hiding? She needed to know the full extent of his deception. When Gavin returned home late that night, Emma pretended to be asleep. Once she heard his soft footsteps retreating to their bedroom, she slipped out of bed and made her way to his study. It was a space Gavin rarely let her enter, insisting it was where he kept sensitive work documents. Tonight, however, Emma was past respecting boundaries. Inside, her eyes landed on a locked drawer in his desk, a place he had always kept off limits. After rummaging through a few other drawers, she found a small key tucked away beneath a stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the lock, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her. The drawer slid open, revealing a stack of neatly organized files. At first, the contents seemed innocuous: old receipts, work contracts, and tax documents. But then her fingers brushed against something unusual: a folder marked with a name she didn't recognize. Chloe Kane. Confused, Emma opened the folder and began flipping through its contents. The first few pages were medical records, but as she read further, the horrifying truth began to take shape. The documents detailed a gender transition, from female to male. Procedures, hormone treatments, surgeries, it was all there, spelled out in cold, clinical terms. And at the top of every page was the name Chloe Kane. Emma's breath caught in her throat as realization dawned. Gavin, her husband, the man she had loved and trusted for years, wasn't who he had claimed to be. He had a past he had never shared with her, one that went far beyond infidelity. The name, Chloe Kane, felt like a ghost in the room, a specter of a life Gavin had worked so hard to bury. By the time Emma returned to their bedroom, her mind was racing with questions. How could he have hidden something so monumental from her? Had their entire marriage been a lie? She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at Gavin's sleeping form. In that moment, she didn't see the man she had married, she saw a stranger. The next morning, Emma confronted Gavin, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and betrayal. She laid the documents on the table between them, daring him to deny what she had discovered. Gavin's face paled as he realized the truth could no longer stay hidden. He tried to explain, stumbling over his words as he recounted the struggles of his past and his reasons for keeping it a secret. But Emma couldn't hear him over the roar of her own emotions. "You lied to me," she said, her voice breaking. "For years, you let me believe I knew you. But I don't. I don't know you at all." Gavin begged for her understanding, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of her accusations. But Emma's heartbreak had turned into fury. She threatened to leave him, to expose everything he had worked so hard to conceal. For Gavin, the thought of losing Emma, and the life he had built with her, was unbearable. But the idea of his past becoming public, of the truth being laid bare for the world to see, filled him with blind panic. As Emma turned to walk away, Gavin snapped. In a moment of fear and desperation, he grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. What happened next was a blur of rage and horror. Gavin didn't register the blood pooling around Emma's lifeless body until the silence in the house became deafening. The storm Gavin had spent years trying to keep at bay had finally arrived, leaving devastation in its wake. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds of the Kane household on April 7, 2012, Gavin Kane stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the lifeless body of his wife, Emma, sprawled on the floor. Blood pooled around her, the stark crimson a brutal contrast to the pristine white tiles. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by Gavin's ragged breaths. His mind raced, a tangled mess of panic, regret, and the chilling realization that his life as he knew it was over. But Gavin wasn't ready to give up. He had spent years constructing a perfect facade, burying his past, building a life, and creating an identity that couldn't be questioned. He couldn't let it all unravel now. The stakes were too high. As the gravity of what he had done sank in, a single, desperate thought took hold: he needed to make this look like something else. Gavin worked methodically, his hands trembling but his mind sharp. He cleaned the knife, wiping away his fingerprints and placing it in Emma's hand to stage the scene. He ransacked drawers, scattered jewelry across the floor, and overturned chairs to simulate a robbery gone wrong. He broke a small window at the back of the house, ensuring the shards fell inward to make it look like an intruder had forced their way inside. Every move was calculated, every detail meant to mislead. By the time he called 911 shortly after noon, Gavin had rehearsed his story. His voice trembled as he spoke to the dispatcher, injecting just the right amount of shock and grief into his words. "I came home from work, and, my wife, she's been murdered," he choked out, his breath hitching for effect. "It looks like someone broke in." The first responders arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the tranquility of the suburban street. Neighbors gathered outside, their faces etched with shock and curiosity. Gavin played the role of the grieving husband flawlessly, his tearful pleas for justice convincing enough to hold back immediate suspicion. But detectives are trained to look beyond appearances. As they surveyed the scene, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. The broken window, for instance, lacked any signs of forced entry around the frame. The items scattered on the floor seemed deliberate, as though placed rather than thrown in haste. And then there was Gavin himself. His grief seemed genuine, but there was a stiffness to his demeanor, a guardedness that piqued their curiosity. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. Detectives began piecing together Emma's final moments, speaking with friends, family, and neighbors. It wasn't long before they uncovered cracks in the Kane family's seemingly perfect image. Emma's closest friend revealed a bombshell. In the weeks leading up to her death, Emma had confided that she suspected Gavin of hiding something significant. She had even hinted at discovering something that had shaken her to her core, though she hadn't shared the details. The investigators' attention turned to Gavin. They combed through his alibi, scrutinized his behavior, and searched for inconsistencies in his story. The more they dug, the more questions arose. Why had Gavin left work so early that day, yet taken so long to call 911? Why were there no signs of a struggle near the supposed point of entry? And why did neighbors report hearing raised voices from the Kane household the night before? Meanwhile, Vanessa Hale was growing impatient. She hadn't heard from Gavin since the night of the murder, and her calls went unanswered. Frustrated and confused, she decided to confront him in person. When she arrived at the house unannounced, her presence sent a ripple of panic through Gavin. She had no idea what had happened, but her persistence made him uneasy. Vanessa's demands for answers only added to the mounting pressure. On April 10, detectives uncovered a critical piece of evidence: Emma's cell phone. Among her messages was an unsent draft, written just days before her death. The message was addressed to her best friend, detailing her discovery of Gavin's past and her growing suspicions about his fidelity. It was clear Emma had been on the verge of exposing everything. This revelation shifted the investigation's focus squarely onto Gavin. Confronted with mounting evidence, Gavin's carefully crafted story began to unravel. The detectives pressed harder, their questions more pointed. His rehearsed answers started to crack under the strain, small contradictions slipping through. Each slip only strengthened their resolve to dig deeper. By April 15, the detectives had built a compelling case against Gavin. The staged burglary was no longer convincing, and the testimonies of Emma's friends painted a picture of a woman who had discovered something life-altering about her husband. Combined with the inconsistencies in his story, the investigators were closing in on the truth. Gavin's once meticulously controlled life was spiraling out of control. The lies he had told for years were collapsing under the weight of scrutiny, and the secrets he had fought so hard to protect were on the brink of exposure. The man who had spent his life hiding from his past now faced the terrifying prospect of it being laid bare for the world to see. On the morning of April 20, 2012, the calm exterior of the Kane household was shattered as police arrived with a warrant. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as Gavin Kane was led away in handcuffs, his face pale but composed. For years, Gavin had fought to keep his past buried, but the weight of his lies had finally caught up with him. His arrest marked the beginning of a case that would soon grip the entire community, and beyond. Inside the interrogation room, the walls felt as if they were closing in on Gavin. The detectives had dismantled his story piece by piece, and now they sat across from him, armed with evidence he could no longer refute. Emma's unsent message, her friends' testimonies, the inconsistencies in his timeline, all pointed to a man with something to hide. Gavin maintained his innocence at first, clinging to the narrative of a botched burglary. But under the relentless pressure of questioning, cracks began to form in his composure. Hours into the interrogation, Gavin broke. His confession spilled out in fragments, his voice trembling as he recounted the night of Emma's death. He admitted to the affair with Vanessa Hale, the escalating arguments with Emma, and the moment of blind panic that led to her murder. He even revealed the truth about his past, that he was born Chloe Kane and had spent his life reconstructing his identity. But Gavin framed the killing as an accident, a tragic result of fear and desperation rather than premeditated intent. The confession, while damning, was only the beginning. As the details of the case emerged, the media latched onto the story, turning Gavin Kane into a household name. The trial, set to begin in May 2012, became a media sensation, drawing reporters, commentators, and curious onlookers eager to witness the unraveling of the Kane family's dark secrets. In the courtroom, Gavin sat stoically as the prosecution laid out their case. They painted him as a man who had lived a life of lies, willing to kill to protect the facade he had carefully constructed. They argued that Gavin's fear of Emma exposing his transgender past, combined with the pressure from Vanessa to leave his marriage, created a perfect storm of desperation that led to murder. The prosecution leaned heavily on Emma's unsent message, framing it as evidence of Gavin's motive to silence her before she could reveal the truth. Vanessa Hale was called to testify, her presence electrifying the courtroom. Visibly shaken, she recounted her relationship with Gavin in painstaking detail. She admitted she had no knowledge of his transgender past and had been blindsided by the revelations after his arrest. Her testimony highlighted Gavin's pattern of deception, showing how deeply entrenched his lies had become. Vanessa's voice broke as she described feeling manipulated, used, and ultimately betrayed. The defense, in turn, portrayed Gavin as a deeply conflicted individual, shaped by years of societal rejection and personal struggle. They argued that his actions were not premeditated but rather the result of a lifetime of fear and self-preservation. They emphasized the psychological toll of living in secrecy, suggesting that Gavin's decision to hide his past was driven not by malice but by survival. While they did not deny his guilt, they pleaded for leniency, asking the jury to consider the complexities of his life. The trial's emotional apex came when Emma's family took the stand, their grief palpable. Her mother, voice trembling, described the devastating loss of her daughter and the betrayal of trusting Gavin. "We welcomed him into our family," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We believed in him, and he destroyed everything." The jury deliberated for days, their task made more difficult by the complexity of the case. On one hand, they were faced with a man who had undoubtedly committed a heinous act. On the other, they grappled with the layers of his identity and the societal pressures that had shaped his life. But in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. On June 15, 2012, the verdict was delivered. Gavin Kane was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The announcement sent ripples through the courtroom, eliciting gasps and muffled sobs from the audience. Gavin remained motionless, his face betraying no emotion, though his hands clenched tightly on the table in front of him. The aftermath of the trial was as devastating as the crime itself. The Kane family's secrets, once hidden behind closed doors, were now the subject of public fascination and scrutiny. Neighbors who had once admired Gavin as a devoted husband and community member struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of his actions. For Emma's friends and family, the trial offered some measure of closure, but the loss was immeasurable. In prison, Gavin was left to confront the wreckage of his life. The identity he had fought so hard to create was now exposed for the world to dissect, leaving him stripped of the control he had once clung to so desperately. Every day, he replayed the events of that fateful night, haunted by the image of Emma's lifeless body and the choices that had brought him to this point. The trial of Gavin Kane became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the destructive power of lies and the cost of living a life built on deception. For the community of Charlotte, it was a story that lingered long after the courtroom had emptied, a chilling example of how even the most picture-perfect lives can harbor unimaginable darkness. The conviction of Gavin Kane sent shockwaves through the community of Charlotte, North Carolina. In a neighborhood where people once prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, the truth about Gavin and the murder of his wife, Emma, was an unimaginable betrayal. The Kanes had been a fixture of the community, a couple who hosted barbecues, volunteered at local charities, and smiled warmly at everyone they met. Now, they were the subjects of hushed conversations and pointed questions. How could this have happened? Were there signs we missed? For Emma's family, the grief was immeasurable. Her mother, who had once embraced Gavin as the perfect son-in-law, now struggled with the anger and guilt of not seeing through his lies. She spent weeks combing through old memories, trying to pinpoint moments when something felt off, times when Gavin's guarded nature might have been more than just shyness. But it was an exercise in futility. "We trusted him," she told a local reporter. "He destroyed not only my daughter's life but all of ours." The media frenzy surrounding the case painted Gavin as a complex yet deeply flawed individual. Headlines alternated between sensationalizing his transgender past and condemning his actions. For activists, the case presented a dilemma. Some feared it would reinforce harmful stereotypes about the transgender community, while others used it as an opportunity to discuss the crushing weight of secrecy and societal rejection. The nuance of Gavin's identity, however, was often lost in the broader narrative of murder and betrayal. Vanessa Hale, whose name had become synonymous with the scandal, faced her own fallout. She became a target for public scrutiny, with tabloids branding her the other woman and speculating about her role in the unraveling of the Kane marriage. Vanessa, once so confident and vibrant, found herself retreating from public life. She quit her job, moved to a neighboring city, and avoided all contact with anyone connected to Gavin or the case. Privately, she battled guilt and regret, haunted by the realization that her ultimatum had been the catalyst for a tragedy far greater than she could have imagined. For the neighbors, the event served as a grim reminder of how little they truly knew about the Kanes, or perhaps anyone. Those who had once exchanged friendly waves with Gavin now avoided mentioning his name. A few quietly admitted to feeling betrayed, as if his lies had been a personal affront. One neighbor, speaking anonymously, said, "It makes you question everyone around you. If he could hide something so big, who's to say others aren't doing the same?" Inside the prison walls, Gavin Kane faced a stark reality. The man who had spent years crafting a life of control and precision was now stripped of all pretense. His name, once synonymous with respectability, was now a reminder of a broken man consumed by his own lies. The isolation of his cell forced Gavin to confront the choices that had led him there. Night after night, he relived the moment he grabbed the knife, the look in Emma's eyes as his fear turned to violence. No amount of justification could quiet the guilt that gnawed at him. Gavin's days were filled with monotony, punctuated only by occasional visits from legal representatives or activists seeking to understand his story. He rarely spoke during these interactions, offering little insight into his actions beyond what he had already confessed. His life, once carefully controlled, was now dictated by the routines and restrictions of incarceration. As the years passed, the story of Gavin and Emma Kane became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties and shared during neighborhood gatherings. Parents used it to warn their children about the dangers of secrecy and the consequences of dishonesty. Teachers at local schools referenced it during discussions on relationships, trust, and identity. The tragedy became more than just a scandal, it became a lesson etched into the collective memory of the community. Yet, the questions lingered. Could Gavin's actions have been prevented if he had felt safe enough to share his past with Emma? Would Emma have forgiven him if she had discovered the truth under different circumstances? And what responsibility did societal expectations play in driving Gavin to conceal his identity so fiercely? These were the questions that haunted those who knew the Kanes and fascinated those who didn't. For some, the story was a testament to the destructive power of lies. Gavin's refusal to be honest with Emma had set off a chain of events that destroyed not only her life but also his own. For others, it was a reminder of the importance of compassion and understanding. What if Gavin had felt he could trust Emma with his truth? What if Emma had been given the chance to understand the man she loved before the lies consumed them both? In the end, the story of the Kanes left behind more than just shattered lives, it left a warning. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. And when they do, they can tear apart even the strongest foundations. For the people of Charlotte, it was a lesson learned too late, but one they would never forget. The story of Gavin and Emma Kane didn't end with the trial or Gavin's imprisonment. Instead, it lingered like a shadow over the lives it touched and the community that once celebrated their picture-perfect image. In the years that followed, the tragedy became a permanent fixture in the collective consciousness of Charlotte, North Carolina, a chilling reminder of how even the most idyllic lives can hide dark, unresolved truths. For Emma's family, the years brought a slow, painful journey of healing. Her mother kept Emma's wedding photo on the mantel, a bittersweet symbol of what had once seemed like the start of a fairy tale. But behind closed doors, the grief was raw. Every holiday, every family gathering carried the heavy absence of Emma's laughter and warmth. "We thought we knew him," her mother once said in an interview, her voice cracking. "But we didn't. None of us really did." The Kanes' tragedy also left a permanent mark on their former neighborhood. For a long time, the house where Emma was murdered stood empty, a stark reminder of what had occurred within its walls. Though the blood was scrubbed from the floors and the police tape removed, the neighbors couldn't shake the memory. Children whispered about the cursed house, and adults avoided discussing it altogether, as if speaking about it might summon the pain anew. When the house eventually sold years later, it was to a family from out of town, unaware of its dark history. In prison, Gavin Kane faded into obscurity. Gone was the meticulous man who had spent years constructing a life of control and precision. Instead, he became just another inmate, marked not by his identity but by the crime that had defined him. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and Gavin's once vivid memories of the life he'd built with Emma began to blur. The laughter they shared, the dinners she lovingly cooked, the evenings spent planning their future, all of it eroded under the relentless passage of time, replaced by the haunting image of her lifeless body on the kitchen floor. Gavin rarely spoke to anyone, even the prison counselors who urged him to open up. He refused visitors, including the occasional activist or journalist seeking to dissect his story. To Gavin, the world outside his cell no longer mattered. His punishment wasn't just the prison walls or the life sentence, it was the inescapable guilt that consumed him daily. In the silence of his cell, he relived the moment he snapped, over and over again, trying to understand how fear had driven him to such violence. Meanwhile, Emma's death and Gavin's trial became a grim legend in Charlotte. Teachers used it as a cautionary tale, discussing the dangers of secrecy and the importance of trust in relationships. In online forums and podcasts, the story was dissected, analyzed, and debated. Some sympathized with Gavin's struggles, arguing that his fear of rejection and societal judgment had pushed him to the brink. Others viewed him as a manipulative figure who chose lies over honesty, selfishly guarding his secrets at the expense of those around him. But no matter the perspective, one thing was clear: the story of Gavin and Emma Kane resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. For those closest to the tragedy, the questions were harder to answer. Could things have ended differently if Gavin had trusted Emma with his past? If she had discovered his secret under less volatile circumstances, would she have forgiven him? And could Gavin's lifelong fear of exposure have been alleviated in a world more accepting of his identity? These were questions without answers, and they haunted everyone who knew the Kanes. Despite the pain, the story left behind a legacy, a warning about the destructive power of lies and the cost of living a double life. It reminded people of the fragile nature of trust, the importance of authenticity, and the lengths to which fear can drive someone. For Gavin, that fear had been his undoing, turning the love he had for Emma into a tragedy that destroyed them both. In the years that followed, the Kanes story faded from the headlines, but its impact endured. For the people of Charlotte, it became a reminder to look closer, to ask the hard questions, and to build their lives on the foundation of truth, no matter how difficult or frightening it might be. For Gavin, the man who had fought so hard to bury his past, the lesson came too late. His secrets, once his shield, became the very thing that unraveled his life. In the end, the tale of Gavin and Emma Kane wasn't just about a murder or a marriage gone wrong. It was about the devastating consequences of fear, deception, and the human need for acceptance. And as the years passed, their story became a haunting echo, a chilling reminder that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always find their way to the surface.